Hi, I'm Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and I'd like to welcome you back to the Profiles in Jewish History series. Many of you might remember that we did this series a little while ago, where we focused on different personalities that have had a profound effect on Jewish history. And we did it in different segments, and we're going to be picking up this series now with a new segment called Lions of Zion. In this series, we're going to explore the individuals who led the Jewish people back to the land of Israel and were the founders, so to speak, of the Zionist movement. Many of these were very unlikely heroes. Many of these names you've heard of, like, let's say, Herzl, Begin, Ben Gurion, and we're going to do all those. There's some you might not have heard of, like Pinsker and Nordau and Lahavdil, Molever, and the Netziv, who you might be familiar with the Netziv, but might not be familiar with his role in the Zionist movement. Some of these personalities were revolutionaries, others were reluctant visionaries. But we are going to look into them and see how together they made what we know as the Zionist movement. Now tonight we're going to focus on the rabbis of the Zionist movement. Now many people don't realize that in the very earliest stages of the Zionist movement, there were rabbis. The rabbis of Eastern Europe were very, very influential in getting this movement off the ground and really shaping the movement. Now as we see the secularization of the movement take over, we'll understand why the rabbis at the beginning don't get much credit, but really they should get just as much, if not more credit, than the later quote-unquote founders who come in with a more secular mindset. And we'll see with their mindset why they really want to erase the fact, so to speak, that there were rabbis who were so influential at the beginning. Now, before we really delve into the personalities tonight, to the rabbis that we're going to cover, I want to set the stage for what the Jewish world looked like at the rise of Zionism. So Zionism, as we know it, comes about in the 19th century, in the 1800s. And if we look at the beginning of the 1800s, as Zionism was really not at all existent, you see a world that it doesn't make sense that Zionism could ever come into. I mean, the idea of Jews returning en masse to Eretz Israel and reclaiming sovereignty was really inconceivable at the beginning of the 19th century. We had a world, at least a European world, where Europe was carved into empires. We had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had been going for 500 years, and there was no reason to think that it wouldn't go for another 500 years. We had the Russian Empire, ruled by the Romanovs for the past 350 years. We had Prussia, which was not yet an empire, but it was soon to be coalesced into the German Empire under Bismarck. And then, of course, we had the Ottoman Empire, the crumbling Ottoman Empire, known for a long time already as the sick man in Europe. It was ruled from Istanbul, and they're the ones that held Eretz Israel, that held the land of Israel. Now, if you look at the situation, you would think that these empires were going to go on forever, and therefore, there's, how would the idea of Jews leaving these empires and going back to the land of Israel, how would that ever happen? Now, we all know that World War I brings essentially destruction to all of these empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist after World War I. The Russian Empire, okay, that becomes the Soviet Union. That's a little bit of a different play into this. The Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. And of course, Germany will take until after World War II to cease to exist. But by the end of World War II, essentially all the empires of the world are going to be gone, really including Britain. So to be a very different world that will pave the way for the return of the Jews to Israel. Now at this time also, the beginning of the 19th century, Eretz Israel was a barren wasteland with fewer than 300,000 people. Now imagine, just to put it into perspective, it's a land that today holds about 10 million people. So a land that today holds 10 million people with still room to grow, with still undeveloped property, undeveloped land that could be developed now with a lot of the technology advancements that the state of Israel has had. That land held 300,000 people, a fraction of what it holds today. Now, we have to be honest with the fact that at that point, most of those 300,000 people were Arabs. So we can't ignore the fact that there were 300,000 Arabs there. Now, that's not 3 million Arabs like today, but it was 300,000 Arabs. Now, what was interesting about these Arabs is most of them were tenant farmers, what were called felachin in Arabic, and they did not own the land. They worked for land owned by absentee landlords from richer parts of the Arab world, because this was a very, like I said, a barren wasteland of the Arab world, of the Turkish Empire, and therefore there are absentee landlords who owned it and hoped to get some wealth out of it, but used essentially the local peasants to work the land. Now, we're going to see that with the rise of Zionism, that the Jews are going to buy the land that eventually, buy a lot of the land that eventually becomes the state of Israel from these absentee landlords. Now, the sparse Jewish population at this point was mainly Sephardic. There had essentially been from really the time of the Ramban, from the 13th century, there had been a trickle of Jewish immigration from different parts. It'll start with the Ramban. It'll pick up a little stronger after the Spanish expulsion in the 15th century, and then subsequently the Portuguese expulsion in the early 16th century. And we'll see a trickle of Sephardic Jewry come in these years. So really up until the beginning of the 19th century, the overwhelming population of Jews living in Israel are Sephardic Jews. They were really the beginning of the resettlement. And they lived essentially on donations from abroad. There was no industry, there was no barely any agriculture, there was nothing within the land to sustain itself. Now, I do want to make a point that's very important for us to make, and I make it often, so if you listen to my lectures, you probably have heard me say this many times, but it's very important. And that is that there was never a time period from the destruction of the Second Temple until this time period where there weren't Jews in the land of Israel. Even according to the Rambam, in order for the way that we sanctify the new moon to happen, it requires there to be a minyan of Jews living in Israel. So there's always been at least a minyan, really more than a minyan. Now, from the destruction of the temple, really until this time period when the Jews start going back en masse in the 19th century, it does wax and it wanes. It goes up and it goes down, but there's never really a time when we left. So I always say it's a fallacy to say that we left at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple and we came back with the Zionist movement. It's not true. There are always Jews there. There are always at least small Jewish communities there, really holding on hope that this is and was the Jewish homeland. And for basically for the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century, well, I'll throw in that the Crusaders before this point had just about wiped out all the Jews, but after the Crusaders is when the Sephardic Jews being kicked out of Spain start to come back. So for several centuries, it's really just the Sephardic Jewish community. Again, a small community compared to the Arab community, which was slightly larger. So out of 300,000 people, you had maybe 10% were Jews, 90% Arabs. That's what Eretz Yisrael looks like at this point, and basically no one there even owns the land, no one there is developing it, no one's there doing anything. There's always a famous quote that is referred to as from Mark Twain. That Mark Twain visits the land of Israel during this time, during the 18th century, and writes how it's just a barren wasteland. It's just like it's disgusting, and it's swamps and it's deserts, and it's just and it's not a place that anyone would want to ever go. Which I always think is a fascinating, really proof of the words of our prophets, where the prophets talk about how the land of Israel will only sprout for the Jewish people, and that's really just been backed up by history, that we had the land of Israel was very fertile and fruitful during the First and Second Temple, but between the real Jewish sovereignty in the land, which we'll say the strong Jewish presence in the land of Israel really ends in the 4th century, until the Jews go back in the 19th century, it's a barren wasteland. So it's almost like the area only produces for the Jews. Now, in Europe, where the overwhelming majority of the Jews of the world were at that time, there's much upheaval going on with the Jewish community. At this point, Haskalah, the idea of the Jewish quote-unquote enlightenment, or as I like to call it, the Jewish endarkenment, had taken hold not only in Western Europe, but now gone over to Eastern Europe. And in many, many places, the Enlightenment promotes ideas of assimilation and rejection of Torah observance. The idea of the Haskalah was really to create a new Jew, a completely new Jew, severing ties to anything that came before. And we're going to see that these ideas of Haskalah are really embraced by the secular Zionist leaders, and we'll see how that plays out when we get to some of those personalities. At the same time, you have the Hasidic movement that starts up, and the Hasidic movement offers an emotional, mystical world that was not tapped into with many Jews before this point. Again, there are always Kabbalistic scholars, there are always scholars of Jewish mysticism, quote unquote, but it was not brought to the populace in any way. The Hasidic movement brings that to the populace, and it's embraced by 90% of Polish Jewry. In the Lithuanian world, in the Lithuanian sphere of influence, you had the Lithuanian Jews following the rational halachic path of the Vilna Gaon. Now, the path of the Vilna Gaon was also heavily mystical, but in a much more rational, logical way. So these are kind of some of the forces you had going on in the world. Really, the upheaval that was coming to the Jewish world philosophically before you have the upheavals of World War I and World War II, which will obviously be very significant and reshaping and really destroying European Jewry. Okay, so that's our backdrop to what the world kind of looks like when the Zionist movement starts. One of the key figures, in my humble opinion, I think who should be celebrated or mentioned at least as the founder of the Zionist movement is somebody by the name of Rabbi Shmuel Molever. Now, who was Rabbi Shmuel Molever? Very interesting individual. Rabbi Shmuel Molever is born in 1824 in a city called Girboki, which is in modern-day Belarus. And he's not from a rabbinic family, but he is from a very scholarly family. And the scholarly genius of his family definitely trickles down to him, and we see from an early age, like many leaders of the Jewish people, shows tremendous promise in Jewish scholarship. He enters the great Volozhiner Yeshiva, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth with our next personality that we're going to discuss tonight. But the Volozhiner Yeshiva was, we call it the mother of all yeshivas. It was the Lahavdil, the Harvard of yeshivas. It was well, maybe Jews should never use Harvard as a positive thing, right? It was the creme de la creme of yeshivas of its time, and he enters that yeshiva at the age of 12. He marries at the age of 15, and he has smicha by the age of 18. So he's already really a Rav by the time he reaches his 20s. And from that time, he serves as a rabbi in various small towns, and he even becomes a Rav in his own hometown, which is interesting because that is not a very common thing that we see. But eventually, he becomes the chief rabbi of Bialystok in 1883. Now, Bialystok is one of the main Jewish hubs, one of the main central cities. So being the chief rabbi of Bialystok, that's a very significant position. And he holds that job for 16 years until his death in 1898. And we'll see from that position as where he is able to really launch the Zionist movement. Now, it's interesting to point out that Rav Molever had several positions that made him not very popular amongst other Eastern European Rabbanim. And that is that Molever was a believer in the idea of German Orthodoxy. Now, when we talk about German Orthodoxy, we're talking about the Hirschian philosophy, known as Torah im derech eretz, the idea of the integration or the synergy of Torah and secular knowledge. Now, there was always a debate if the ideas of Hirsch were only meant for Western Europe, where the ideas of modernity were much stronger and affected the Jewish community in a much stronger way. The assimilation of Western Europe never really hits Eastern Europe because, let's face it, Jews were never allowed to be Russian noblemen, and it wasn't happening. But in Western Europe, where Jews, the emancipation of the Jews happened much earlier, much quicker, that's where Hirsch brought in his ideas of Torah im derech eretz, and it was debated if these ideas were relevant or necessary in Eastern Europe. And some Eastern European Rabbanim believed that it was relevant and necessary. Many believed it wasn't. Rav Molever was one of the most famous ones. Another very famous one was Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the Sridei Eish, a few others. But he was a believer in these ideas of the need for secular studies in the Jewish community. He believed that there should be trade schools, that there should be secular education, and that there should be fluency in the local language, which was Russian. He believed that this was necessary to advance the Jewish community. This was a very unpopular position. In fact, he wrote an article called Hayira v'Haskala, which argued for a balance between fear of heaven, the idea of what we call Yiras Shamayim, fearing Hashem, sort of a euphemism here for Torah observance, and enlightened engagement with the world. In other words, that the ideas of Haskalah were not bad at their core, but they were bad in the fact that they were abandoning Torah. So therefore, if you could have Haskalah with Torah and you could bring it together, that's what was needed for the Russian Jewish community, believe Rav Shmuel Molever. Now, the article angered everybody, right? It angered the other rabbis, it angered the Haskalah members. He'd made no friends with this article, but it showed his stature that he could put out such an article and still remain a leader of the Jewish people. Now, if we want to look at the one event that really was the impetus for the start of the Zionist movement, the modern Zionist movement, it was the pogroms of 1882 in Russia. Now, in Russia, what happened this time, Russia has always been anti-Semitic. I don't think there's ever a time period in Russian history where they weren't anti-Semitic. Maybe now it's the best it's ever been for Jews in the Russian Empire. We all know what it was like under the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was no improvement for what came before. Or maybe it even wasn't improvement for what became before, which was really worse because the Russian Empire was terrible. The Romanovs were terrible anti-Semites, and at this time period, the waning days, the last 30 years or so of the Romanovs, they became just vehemently anti-Semitic. And there was a set of laws that were passed known as the May Laws, which were similar in many ways to the Nuremberg laws that would later come in Germany 50 years later, or 60 years later, after this point. And it spawned a number of pogroms throughout Russia. And it became very, very clear at this time period in 1882 that Russia was no place for the Jewish people. And so we're going to see a mass immigration of Jews trying to leave Russia. And, if you ever saw the movie Fiddler on the Roof or the play Fiddler on the Roof, that's this time period, right? This is when Jews are leaving Russia en masse. And most of these Jews will come to the United States, which at this point had very loose immigration laws. And this is really the beginning of the American Jewish community. Now, Jews had been in America since the founding of the country, but a very, very small yet somewhat influential group. At this point, we come en masse. Now, before this, in the early 19th century, there were a sizable group of German Jews that come, but it's from 1882 to 1925 when Russian Jewry comes to the number of 2.5 million Jews, and that becomes the backbone of the American Jewish community. Now, it happened that the German Jews who were there before did not, they wanted to help their Russian immigrant brothers and sisters and cousins, but they didn't want to integrate them in their communities. And that's what you're going to see as this Russian Jewish community starts to prosper. They have to make separate institutions from the German Jewish community. And that's why almost every American Jewish community had two country clubs. Right here in Cleveland, we had the Beachmont and the Oakwood Club. In Cincinnati, where I was before, there was the Los Santivo Club and the Ridge Club, I think they were called. Where I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, there was the Standard Club and the Progressive Club. It was the story of every Jewish community because the German Jews treated the Russian Jews kind of like the Goyim it treated the German Jews, and that's how it played out. But this was the backdrop. The Jews realized they had to leave Russia, and even though the majority go to America until America takes on their isolationist policies after World War I, and the doors are shut to Jewish immigration till well after World War II, this was the impetus for the beginning of the Zionist movement. Now, what was it at this point? It was something called originally Chibat Zion, and then the name morphed to be Chovevei Zion, which means lovers of Zion. And the idea was quite simple. The idea was that Jews got to get out of Russia, out of the Russian Empire. Now, the Russian Empire at this time was as big as it ever was. It controlled all of what we now call the former Soviet Union. It controlled most of what we call Poland today. It controlled large swaths of the world and almost the entirety of the Jewish people. And the idea was that they got to get out of Russia, out of the Russian Empire, so let's go to the land of Israel. Quite simple. It was not necessarily out of an idea that the Jewish people needed to return to the land of Israel as much as it was the Jews that need to leave Russia. That's really what it was. Now, mind you, when we talk about Chovevei Zion, the concept of Chovevei Zion, founded now in 1882, this is now 16 years before Herzl comes on the scene, before the Zionist movement. There's no concept of political Zionism. In other words, there's no dream of Jewish sovereignty per se, a Jewish state, a Jewish government. None of that exists until Herzl. None of it. The idea was quite simply the Jews should live in Israel. If we have to live somewhere, it shouldn't be under the Romanovs. It should be in Israel, under the Turks, or whoever else controls the land of Israel. But that's where Jews should be. And the idea was that Jews would immigrate there. And they would form agricultural settlements, so they would be able to try and develop the land, they would build the land, they would do a lot of things they couldn't do in Russia. And Russia, in many places, Jews couldn't own land, they couldn't develop land, they could barely have wages, it was terrible. But the idea is we'll go to the land of Israel, we'll build agricultural communities, we'll sustain ourselves, and that will be how we'll survive the anti-Semitism of the Romanovs, of the Russian Empire. And the driving force behind this is Shmuel Molover. He's the founder of the movement, and he's the one who will drive it. And we'll see he's the one who does many of the significant things that made it possible to really be a force to reckon with within the world as a whole. He raised the funds, he recruited the settlers, and he took the practical action. Now, one of the most significant things that he did, probably above all the work, was that in the same year of its founding, in 1882, he travels to Paris. And he meets with someone by the name of Baron Edmund de Rothschild. Now, our next lecture will be all about the Rothschilds and Baron de Rothschild, Baron Edmund de Rothschild, and we'll talk more about how he plays into it. But suffice it to say, he becomes the philanthropist of Chovevei Zion. He's the one who financially supports the movement, and without him, it never happens. And even though it was his funds, or really his father's funds, or his grandfather's funds, because he retires at a young age and just becomes a philanthropist, never works to earn any of the money, but it was really Shmuel Molover who comes in and is essentially Makariv him. He brings him over to the idea of Chovevei Zion, he brings him over to the idea of the need that Jews can no longer survive in Russia, and we have to get them to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. Now again, never in this discussion is it ever brought up that Western European Jews should go. Rav Molover doesn't go to Paris and say, Rothschild, you need to join us in Israel. He doesn't go to England and say, join us in Israel. He doesn't go to any of the Western Jewish communities. He's saying that we got to get Jews out of Eastern Europe. And he successfully convinces Baron Edmund de Rothschild. And we'll talk more about that next week, how he does it. But that was probably one of the most significant things that he does that makes it that the movement has financial stability. Now, throughout Russia, he encourages Aliyah. The original settlement of Chovevei Zion was Petach Tikva, a city it's a thriving city today, and he encourages the Jews of Bialystok to move to Petach Tikva, which again was just a struggling village at this point. Now, what happens early on in the Zionist movement is that the Chovevei Zion, yes, I said Shmuel Molover is the founder and that he did the work, he raised the money, he brought it together, he made an organization. But this idea of Chovevei Zion clubs, so to speak, had existed before him. And there were many of them throughout all of Europe. And watching the anti-Semitism of Russia take hold, there are many of them that start to coalesce, that start to organize, that try and be something significant. So just as Shmuel Molover is really building this religious Chovevei Zion and Bialystok, there's secular Chovevei Zion groups that are also gaining strength and gaining popularity. So if the religious head of Chovevei Zion is Shmuel Molover, there's someone named Leon Pensker who is the secular head of the secular groups. And obviously these groups are going to collide, and they're really on a collision course. Because while they both believe they got to get the Jews out of Eastern Europe, and they both believe that the place for these Jews to go is the land of Israel, what they obviously don't agree on is what the religious nature of those communities should be. Shmuel Molover obviously felt that it should be based on Torah. These should be Torah communities. These should be Jewish communities. Whereas Leon Pensker is a secular Jew, heavily influenced by the ideas of Haskalah, without the Yira, without the Torah part that Shmuel believed in. Says, no, the idea is we're going to create a new Jew, a new community, we're going to get out of Russia, and we're going to make our own community in the land of Israel. Again, no nationalism yet, just the idea of communities of Jews in the land of Israel. Now, there's obviously much tension between these two groups, and the tension will really come to a head, and what will happen is Shmuel will really stick with the Chovevei Zion until the end of his life. We're going to see the other religious leaders will not necessarily stick with it, but Rav Shmuel Mohilever is going to stick with it until the end of his life. Now, in 1893, a new spiritual branch of Chovei Tzion was created under his leadership, and it was called the Merkaz Ruchani, in other words, the spiritual center, because he said, okay, we're going to work with you. I'm not going to abandon this movement. We should work together, but we're going to at least have a spiritual center that will influence the ideas of Chovei Tzion. Now, Merkaz Ruchani was abbreviated to Mizrahi. Now, Mizrahi also means Eastern, because they were Eastern facing. Again, they were in the East, but the idea of Israel being in the East, because it's the East of Western Europe, even though it was West of Eastern Europe, but the idea of Mizrahi, this is where it comes from. And the idea is really, there's the Merkaz Ruchani, is the spiritual center of the Chovei Tzion movement. So even with all these struggles, he does not leave the movement. He just makes sure to, because he believed if he left, then there'd be nothing Torah-based in the movement at all. So he sticks with it with his Merkaz Ruchani, founded in 1893. Now, we're going to see that in 1901, Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines, after Rav Shmuel passes away, it comes together with several of the disciples of Rav Shmuel Mohilever, and they make the organization a real organization that will go on as the Mizrahi movement as we know it today. But here in the 1890s, from 1893 until that point, it represents a part of the Chovei Tzion movement, and it'll be Rav Reines who will come in and make it its own movement in 1901 and 1902. Now, it's interesting to point out that the Agudas Yisrael, which is often regarded as the right-wing representative group of the Jewish people, that is going to break away from Mizrahi in 1912 and form its own organization. And the impetus for that will be at the 10th Zionist Congress. There was a motion by the Mizrahi movement that the Jewish state that they were working on, again, it was still 38 years from existence at that point, but that the future Jewish state would fund religious schools, and this movement failed at the Zionist Congress, at the 10th Zionist Congress. Many of the members of Mizrahi felt that that was the line in the sand. There's no place for Torah Judaism in the Zionist movement. So they left the Zionist movement to form their own organization. That was Agudas Yisrael. Again, a breakaway from Mizrahi, who decided at that point they would stay within the Zionist movement, similar to their intellectual forefather, Rav Shmuel Mohilever, who always felt that you got to stay in to hold on to what we can spiritually. So that was really the break of Mizrahi and Agudas Yisrael in 1912. Now, while Rav Mohilever stayed within the larger movement, we see how he stayed in the larger movement. First of all, he presided over the 1884, the 1887, the 1889 Chovei Tzion conferences. He established a rabbinical committee to ensure halachic oversight of the agricultural settlements in the land of Israel. He constantly pushed for unity, urging Jews to settle in the land of Israel because it was a mitzvah, because it was one of the obligations of a Jew. And he really is there to provide the religious element until the end of his life. In 1897, at the First Zionist Congress, which was right at the end of his life, he sent the following message. He said, "It is essential that the Congress unite all the sons of Zion, even if there be among the differences of opinion regarding religion." And in the final letter, and in his final letter, he called for settlement of the foundation of our people's existence. So he was always trying to bring together the Jewish people, and with the idea that there had to be Torah at its base. There had to be religious observance. You couldn't do, as he already saw the secularists of the movement were trying to do, you couldn't create a new Jew. That was never going to work. That was never going to be a thing. Now, he passes away in 1898, right after the Zionist movement really launches as a movement, and therefore he's not really there for a lot of the development that comes after that. Now his movement lives on, like I said, in the form of the Mizrahi movement, and that will carry his ideas on until this very day in many ways. And it's interesting, just to point out, that there is a tribute to Rav Shmuel Mohilever in Eretz Yisrael. There's a kibbutz known as Kibbutz Gan Shmuel, which was named in his honor, which, funny enough, is a completely secular kibbutz. It's not a religious Zionist kibbutz. So, I'm sure there's an interesting story behind how that kibbutz got its name. But if I was asked a question, who really founded the modern Zionist movement, I would say it was Rav Shmuel Mohilever. I would say he's the one who deserves the credit as the founder of the Zionist movement. Now, he was not the only rabbi involved. There were many rabbis involved, many great rabbis. The other great name most associated with the Chovevei Tzion, with this pre-Zionist movement of the Chovevei Tzion, was Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, as he is known. Now, the Netziv comes into a scene in the Jewish world. He's born in 1816, and he's coming after the Great Vilna Gaon. Now, the Great Vilna Gaon emphasized the ideas of Torah and Eretz Israel. The Vilna Gaon, it said he himself tried to get to the land of Israel. He was not able to. He sent many of his disciples, and the beginning of the Ashkenazi Jewish community was the disciples of the Vilna Gaon. And that's why until this very day, the customs of the land of Israel and the Ashkenazi community, the non-Hasidic Ashkenazi community, follow that of the Vilna Gaon tradition, because it was his disciples who really got there first, to start the Ashkenazi community. If you wanted, one of the strongest places to see this is if you're ever in the old city of Jerusalem and you go to the Chorva Shul. The Chorva Shul is run by the Zilberman clan, we'll call them, the Talmidim Rebbe Zilberman, who really try to follow the letter of the law and the customs of the Vilna Gaon. So you'll see a lot of things there that are seemingly straight out of the Vilna Gaon's books that are not necessarily the practice of the rest of Ashkenazi Jewry. Now, this was the beginning of the what we call the Old Yishuv, the Jewish settlement of the land of Israel. Now, his main disciple was someone by the name of Rav Chaim Rabinovich, and he launched a revolution. He proposed that Europe should have a full-time Torah institution supported by all of Europe, where the great minds of Europe could come together to study Torah, and the Torah could flourish. And that, of course, was the Volozhin Yeshiva, and Rav Chaim Rabinovich became known as Rav Chaim Volozhiner. And that's what Volozhin became. It became the center for the greatest minds of European Jewry, and it also became the model for the modern yeshiva system. All of our yeshivas today, for the most part, are modeled after the Volozhin system, the style of learning of the Volozhiner system, and the one thing that is not necessarily replicated in all yeshivas is the quality of student. That Volozhin was a elitist yeshiva. It was for the best of the best, and now we've taken that system and essentially popularized it. We've made it for the populace, that this becomes the standard that every boy should go through at least several years at the beginning of his developing life, high school and post-high school for at least a couple years. Now, this is the world that the Netziv comes into. Netziv, as we said, was born in 1816. Now, he marries into a great family. He marries the daughter of Rav Yitzchak Volozhiner, the son of Rav Chaim Volozhiner. So he marries the granddaughter of the one who founds the Volozhiner Yeshiva and the daughter of the Rosh Yeshiva. Now, this essentially makes him an heir apparent in many ways to the yeshiva. But his father-in-law never really saw his greatness, at least in the earlier years, and did not think he was going to be the one to take over the yeshiva. He thought it was going to be a cousin of theirs by the name of Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, better known as the Beis Halevi, who was also there in Volozhin at this time, and he thought that he would be the one to take over the yeshiva. Now, initially, the Netziv and the Beis Halevi worked together, but and they had very different personalities, and eventually it becomes clear that the Netziv is the one who can take the yeshiva to the next level, not the Beis Halevi. The Beis Halevi will leave and found the community of Brisk, which will become the anchor of the Brisker dynasty. Now, here's what's interesting for the Zionist movement, because you have the Rosh Yeshiva now, the Netziv, of the mother of all yeshivas, probably makes him one of, if not the most influential Jews in all of Europe, and he is part of Chovevei Tzion. He becomes, if you will, the Rosh Yeshiva of Chovevei Tzion. Now, so where you have Rav Shmuel, as we mentioned before, Shmuel Mohilever is the one who gets things done. He's the action man. You have the Netziv who offers the erudition of having a Rosh Yeshiva behind this movement. Now, the Netziv and Rav Shmuel Mohilever are very different. As we mentioned before, Rav Shmuel is very into the idea that there should be secular studies in the Jewish community. The Netziv fought tooth and nail to keep secular studies out of the Volozhiner Yeshiva. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were at odds on that point. I don't think Rav Shmuel Mohilever thought the yeshiva should have secular studies, but there was much pressure led by the Maskilim against the Volozhin Yeshiva to incorporate secular studies, and they brought the Russian government in on their side. And in 1892, we're going to see that the Netziv chooses to actually close the yeshiva as opposed to bowing to the pressures of the Russian government. But again, having him as the leader, the Rosh Yeshiva of the Chovei Tzion movement offered that erudition. You had this great rabbi, the great Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, the most influential Jew in Europe, quite possibly, who was into this idea that Rosh Shmuel Mohilever was working so hard on, and gave his blessing and was involved, and he was involved in the Chovei Tzion. He went to the meetings of the Chovei Tzion, he went to the conferences of the Chovei Tzion, offering that erudition to the movement, so that when Rosh Shmuel Mohilever would go to communities and say, we got to get out of Russia. We got to go somewhere. We got to go to the land of Israel. The fact that the Netziv's kayach, his strength was behind it, it's what gave the movement what it needed to really go. Because the movement, you need the action man, but you need that leader behind it to be able to say that this is what the Jewish people are supposed to do. Now, the positions of the Netziv were that he insisted the settlement must be tied to mitzvah observance, especially those related to the land of Israel. The ideas of Shemitah, the sabbatical year, the tithing, all these ideas of the land of Israel needed to be observed meticulously by the settlements of the Chovei Tzion. He also felt that Jews must give financial support and spiritual support to the Jews going to the land of Israel. So especially the Western European Jews that weren't even being spoken to about leaving, they should give their support to the Jews in the land of Israel. Now, at the 1887 conference of Chovei Tzion, he became the official advisor to the movement, and in 1891 he published his influential letter, Acharis Kereishis, calling on Jews to support settlement efforts as a religious obligation. Again, this is the Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhin Yeshiva saying that Jews across the world had to support those going back to the land of Israel as a religious obligation. And he himself tried to move to the land of Israel. And on his way to Eretz Yisrael from Volozhin, Volozhin is in modern-day Belarus, and he got as far as Warsaw, and unfortunately in Warsaw he had a stroke, and that is where he passed away, and that is where he is buried in the Great Jewish Seminary and the Great Jewish Cemetery in Warsaw. But his legacy continued on with this idea of the Jewish people wanting to go to the land of Israel. Now I'll throw in one more rabbinic personality that we'll see come up in the Zionist movement. We'll talk about him a little bit more next week with Rothschild, and that is Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. We're going to see that Rav Yitzchak Elchanan will also be a backer of Chovei Tzion, and he'll be the posek. He'll be the halachic advisor to the Chovei Tzion movement. So here are three giants you have, three giant rabbis, Rosh Shmuel Mohilever, the action man, the Netziv, the Rosh Yeshiva, and Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, the posek, who are all behind this Chovei Tzion movement. Now, had they remained the heads, if they had really remained at the helm of the movement, it would have become a very different Zionist movement. But as we said, the secularists, led by Leon Pinsker, will essentially marginalize the rabbis. We're going to see that the Netziv in many ways will back away. He won't agree with a lot of the decisions that we'll talk about next week, and they're going to say it's just not a place for them. Rosh Shmuel Mohilever always stay connected, but it would have been a very different Zionist movement if it would have remained these three giants at the helm, and it would have been a very different state of Israel today had they been the ones at the helm of the Zionist movement from that point forward. Now, I'll just say one last point about at least these three rabbis that are mentioning now, and really all the rabbis that were involved in Chovei Tzion at this time. There's no concept at this point of what we call modern orthodoxy, or the separation as we kind of have it today between, let's say, more right-wing yeshiva, Haredi orthodoxy, and Tzioni, Mizrahi, modern orthodoxy. It didn't exist. It just wasn't there. As we said, it was all together at least until 1910 when the Agudas Yisrael will break off. So all these rabbis wore the classic Lithuanian dress, the long frocks, the big hats, the big beards. That's how they all dressed, because they were the founders of the Zionist movement. God willing, next week we'll continue our series and we'll discuss the life and times and the contribution of Baron Edmund de Rothschild, and I look forward to doing it together with you.